Ayati aga oya. Seangwal chusligan chinaika. Chi ayati
ganas na kulangan kaman na nakto atot tawag ito ito at nakto kubalog ito ino kasaktuang mo kanatami akagutama.
I'm Lenore Grenoble. I'm a professor of linguistics here at the University of Chicago. I study Arctic indigenous languages, and in particular I'm interested in how languages are lost, language endangerment, and then how they are revitalized and the causes behind that. Across that broad territory, we find maybe 50 indigenous languages, depending a little bit on how you count, whether you count certain things as dialects of a single language or a single language. These languages range in terms of vitality with probably Greenlandic. Kalaallisut is the name for Greenlandic in the language of Greenland. Being the most robust and vital, it's the national and official language of Greenland, and it has a lot of autonomy. There's maybe 50,000 speakers of Greenlandic. Two languages that are very critically endangered with only a couple of speakers. Edelman is a case of that, where the latest reports coming from Siberia report only 3 speakers left of Edelman. Some varieties of Sami, also Akala Sami, is reported as having 1 speaker left. At the moment, we consider all of the Arctic indigenous languages under some sort of threat. And it's really hard to know what's going to happen in the future. Some of the languages probably will be lost, in particular where there's only a handful of speakers and if the communities themselves aren't particularly wealthy. If you're worried about feeding your children, that's your priority. People often ask why we should save languages and what does actually saving languages mean. From a linguistic standpoint, saving languages means documenting them, recording them, studying them, learning to understand them while we still have speakers to ask questions about and have good records of how the language was spoken and used when there are fluent speakers. This is really important for linguistic science. We so far really only understand a small range of how language tells us about the human condition, about the range of possibilities in language and what goes on in the human brain. And language is a clear window to the human brain. People do talk about Inuit languages as having lots of words for snow, and that's a little bit of a misunderstanding, because one big question with these languages, and one of the very cool things about them, is you have to ask what a word is. The languages are what we call polysynthetic. You take a base and you add some suffixes and you can create new words. And you can add a lot of suffixes. So a word can become infinitely long. These long words translate into sentences in English. So they're very, very, very long, and it's completely packaging language in a very different way. And snow is not really the thing that drives Inuit cultures. What it is sea ice. And that's a very good example of a place where there's a very, very rich set of roots and base words that can then be formed into longer and longer ones to say very, very specific things about the sea ice and how thin it is, how old it is, where it's been formed from, whether or not you can walk on it, whether it's likely to tip over. This may seem trivial, but it's hugely important, especially as sea ice is melting. So it's a good example of trying to understand how Western science classifies sea ice and how indigenous people classify sea ice. And you can see that in their language and where the mismatches in knowledge and how those mismatches can inform one side versus the other. The overwhelming majority of cases, languages are being lost for social and economic reasons. There's a language that the local language is relatively small in terms of numbers of speakers and has less power. And then another language, an external language, in many cases a colonizing language, has more power, provides access to greater social prestige, more money, higher economic status. Education policies from large nation states generally promote monolingualism, education in the language of the state. And so these factors come together and cause what we call language shift. Many of the languages in the Arctic are in the situation that they're in now because of actual oppression, repression from governments. So in Canada, in the United States, in Russia, and actually in the Scandinavian states, people were sent as children to boarding schools and were punished for speaking their languages. Those people chose not to speak their language in the home because they didn't want their children to go through what they went through. So they go through a lot of trauma, and that has been one of the biggest problems for moving language revitalization forward. When communities lose their language, they really talk about that as loss and feel pain and suffering and feel the loss. And we see that there's a real connection between having access to the ancestral language, the indigenous language, the local language, whatever you want to call it. There's a connection between that and not just mental well-being and a sense of identity, but also increasingly there's evidence that shows that that's important for physical well-being. And studies in the Arctic have reported a decrease in cholesterol, heart disease, diabetes, along with a decrease in suicide and other mental health problems for people who have access to their languages. The single biggest thing that we need to revitalize a language is to use it. So people need to have some kind of access to the language, and free and open access. They need to be able to learn it. They need to be able to speak it, to write it. One of the most remarkable things happening now is a huge resurgence in interest in the vitality of these languages, and in particular young people. Young people in their late teens and early 20s are really embracing the need to do something about the languages. So young people are using social media, Facebook, Twitter, emails, texting like crazy to support their languages. And I think that's one of the most exciting things that's happening now. People talk about vitality and sustainability. They don't want to talk about language shift, language death, language endangerment. They really want to be looking forward to the future, and people are being very, very creative. This is actually driving orthographic reform in Inuktitut. Inuktitut communities use two different writing systems. Some Inuktitut communities use the Roman alphabet, and some have been using syllabics. The syllabics they represent the syllable, their shapes. They were actually borrowed from the Cree. And writing in syllabics, even though it has great symbolic power, you look at it and you know that that is Inuktitut. You see the syllabics, it means it's very emotional for a lot of people, but it's also not good for texting. And so if you really want to revitalize the language and have it be part of a modern world, you need to be able to use it the way that you want to. So right now, we think there's 6,000 to 7,000 languages in the world, and there's a complete mismatch between the percentage of population that speaks numbers of languages. So the overwhelming majority of the world speaks a very small number of languages. This has to do with history, with politics. It has nothing to do with the nature of the languages themselves. The actual rates of language endangerment and loss are hotly debated. This is one of the big questions, but linguists agree there is massive language loss, and this century, that we'll lose half of the world's languages by the end of this century, and more extreme estimates are up to 90% of the world's languages will be lost. Probably that is true somewhere in there if revitalization activities don't take place.